Open your Bible. We'll be in Romans, of course. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles in the chairs around you. The English Standard Version is what we'll be reading from. Just to remind you, we have these little house churches, and if you're sick of me saying this, that means good, you've gotten it. If you're not sick of me saying it, that means you haven't gotten it yet, and I'm glad I keep doing it. We have these house churches that want to get along. They're maybe no more than 100 strong in the city of Rome. Groups of maybe 10 to 12, Jews and Gentiles together, and they're having a great issue with God. In fact, they're having two great issues with God. They look at the world, and they say, the world's just hell in a handbasket, so how is God in any way ruling? What in heaven's name has Jesus possibly done when the world is as screwed up as it is? And we could ask that same question today. And then the second question that they have is, we're not so clear, they say to Paul, on how God has been faithful to what he promised in the Old Testament. So to prove to us God has been righteous to come through on what he said he would do, and then we'll have an easier time following him. And in particular, that second issue gets raised because Jesus comes, a Jewish person, an Israelite. Jesus dies on behalf of Israel, and most of Israel will not believe in him. So when Israel en masse is not believing in their Messiah, then oh my gosh, has God's plan been foiled? Well, Paul sets out in chapter 3, verse 21, to answer that first question. How is it that God has indeed fixed life? And his answer is many. It's really summed up in one answer, and that is God has fixing life one person at a time. I stand as testimony that Jesus is the ruling king. Now the sub-answers to that are the things that I've listed, and you'll see those on the boards above me. And that is, when Jesus resurrects, it says in Romans 1, he sits next to the Father at the right-hand side. The Father removes his crown, he places it on Jesus, and he says, you're the ruling king. And you in all nobility, as the original creator, are the one that are going to put things back together. We know when Jesus came, he lived perfectly. He actually fulfilled the Torah and the requirement of those 613 commandments. He's the only one that took the weight of all the Torah had on him and fulfilled it. And then when he looks at us, he says to you and I, you'll never pull this off. Remember our line, if the Jews can't do it, you can't do it. And what he says is, if you simply place your faith in me, I will take the requirement of the Torah off of you. I'll take all of that commandment weight you've got on you, and I will give you my obedience already. He imputes that to us, so that when Doug McBride, who is saved by Jesus now, wakes up, I have already the obedience of Jesus on me. I have only to walk down the path that he has already traveled for me. He has offered himself as a sacrifice for all of us, spilling himself and his blood to remove this condemnation. Remember, this whole deal is a trial in Romans. And God is being put on trial as to whether or not he's been righteous and faithful. And I don't know if you recall this, but in the first two chapters, Paul starts out by saying, just before we put God on trial, let's remember something. We're the guilty ones. We're the ones that have screwed this whole place up. How dare we actually blame God for what we screwed up? But oh, by the way, God will still allow you to question him. But that trial, that issue, that guilt that is really on me, Jesus is now removed. And then as I place my faith in him, he kills this old person of mine and resurrects a new being that is fully in Jesus, a full heir with him. And he indwells us personally with his Spirit, enabling us to actually obey the commandments and live the life out that he's always called us to, not under our power in any way, but under his. And he illuminates our sense in this place, in this planet, knowing how dark it is and how much sin there is and how much evil there is. And yet, he tells us, as we enter into this life with Jesus, we will now walk through a life that he walks. We will experience the suffering of Jesus. And as we suffer, we will be reminded we are now co-living out the life of Jesus. So we have purpose now in our suffering. And all day long, while we're living out this life of healing on behalf of humanity, the Spirit inside us, the Spirit of Jesus literally whispering to us that we are His. Abba Father, Abba Father, Abba Father, Daddy Father, you are mine, I am yours, we are family members, and everything that I've told you is true. Paul concludes that answer at the end to question number 1, how is he fixing life, with all of these plethora of answers, all summed up in this statement that he is fixing life one life at a time. And then he turns in chapter 9 to the second question. How is it that God has been faithful? And he does this by literally retelling the story of the Old Testament. And he tells them several things. He says, first of all, God always planned on Jews and Gentiles being in His family. And so he looks at this church in Rome and he says that you're bickering with one another, but what you're missing, because you don't even want either one of you there, the Gentiles don't want the Jews there, the Jews don't think the Gentiles should be there, and he says your testimony, the fact that you're together, proves that God has been faithful. The fact that Chris Kelso is with us today, our Jewish comrade who follows Jesus, with all of us Gentiles, is proof that God has done what He promised to do. Every time you see our Jewish friend Chris enter this room as a follower of Jesus, joining with all of us knucklehead pagan Gentiles, we should be reminded that God has come through on what He promised Abraham, Jew and Gentile alike. So say thank you to Chris with me. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Chris. There we go. He also points out that the original relationship with Abraham, where all this started, was always by faith. It's not by race or religion. It's not because you go to church every Sunday or do all the right things. It's not because, he tells Israel, because you have the Torah. It's not because you have the temple. It's not because you have the festivals. It's none of that. It was always by faith. Abraham had faith, and God brought him into His family. David had faith, and he was brought into his family. This is always the way it has been, and this is the way it is today. And then he makes it clear to them, you are relying, my Jewish brothers and sisters, on the Torah, as if God gave you the Torah at Sinai, and now you have this permanent membership with God. And that was never supposed to give you life. The Torah does two things. The Torah actually tells you how sinful you are and how you cannot keep the commandments. So the very thing you're clinging to, he tells the Jews, to give you status with God, is pointing its finger back at you and telling you how guilty you are. And on top of that, the Torah was pointing to the Messiah all along. So you missed exactly what God promised in the Old Testament. In fact, he tells them that emphatically, you've completely misunderstood what God promised, which is exactly why you don't think God has been faithful. If you knew what God promised, you would see how faithful He's been. He tells them, there's almost like there's two Israels. He says to his Jewish brothers and sisters, you've categorically mistaken the Israel that was given a task to carry the torch of salvation forward. It was a message you were supposed to give, with the fact that whether you were saved or not. See, that had nothing to do with it. When God told Israel at Mount Sinai, you will be light to the world, He didn't promise them you will all just be saved because of it. That was their task. When God told Doug McBride, you have a task. You will be in front of the podium and you will teach every week on Sunday. This has nothing to do with my salvation. It's a task. And I cannot confuse the two of them together. Does that make sense? So there's an Israel, ethnic Israel, that was given a task, but it's not to be confused with the renewed Israel, the Israel of faith, of which, by the way, Paul says, you and I, as Gentiles, minus Chris, are all a part of because Chris was already there. Does that make sense? This is what he says. And by the way, he tells them, in the Old Testament story, there was always a small subset of the Jews that actually believed. He called them a remnant. And so it's always been like that. So what does he say? God has been righteous. God absolutely has been faithful. He kept His word to the absolute letter to build a covenant people of Jew and Gentile that was based on faith, and He gave them the Spirit, and He gave them life, and He's fixing life one person at a time. We cannot question whether God is righteous. We are now in the last 2 weeks of this whole argument and answer Paul has in this trial scene to answer these two major questions. And this morning and next week, we will look at this last half of chapter 11 of Romans, where Paul will finish answering how God has been faithful to what he promised in the Old Testament. So this is a pinnacle 2 weeks, and you will feel the buildup, if you read this right, of where he is headed in 3 weeks from now. The 1st of February will be our movement to chapter 12, and in chapter 12 through chapter 16, Paul will stop giving what I would refer to as theology. He will stop explaining what is true, if you will, what is just a fact, and he will start moving on how should it affect you, church? How should you behave? How should it come out of you now, Roman churches and Creekside, now that you know what God has done for you? And Jeremy Mann will be giving that first sermon on chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, which is extremely pinnacle to that whole kickoff of chapters 12 through 16. To remind you, chapter 11, what Paul does is he asks two sub-questions, if you will, as a part of this bigger question of how has God been faithful. He first starts out in chapter 11, verse 1, and he says, you know, I see how you could have come to this conclusion, so let me ask this question. Has God forsaken then his people, meaning ethnic Israel? They're not believing, and so is he forsaken them? And Paul's answer is obvious. He says, no, look at me. I'm Jewish. I'm saved. I'm following Jesus. I am the answer to that question. Has God given up on Israel? You'll hear this term, and Derek is teaching upstairs, and boy, I encourage you to do it. And he's teaching on Revelation upstairs, and they meet at 9:15, from 9:15 to 10. And he's teaching the whole book of Revelation. And there's a lot of time, this period that we're in is referred to as the time of the Gentiles. And it's really it's a misnamed term. It's only the time of the Gentiles because we are now coming into the church along with the Jews. A better way of saying this would be, we're the time of the and Gentiles. I think there's a much more accurate way of saying what God is doing. So Paul's answer to them is emphatic. He says, is God done with us? Look at me. He saved me. He's clearly not done saving Israel. He then moves to a second question, which we'll look at this morning and next week. He says, granted that Israel has stumbled, is it permanent? Look at Romans chapter 11, and we'll begin in verse 11. So I ask, Paul says, did they stumble, that's ethnic Israel, did they stumble in order that they, ethnic Israel, might fall? By no means, he says, rather through their trespass salvation has now come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. He's going to answer this question. Has Israel, they kept stumbling and stumbling for millennia, and then they stumbled and rejected Messiah, and now they're continuing to stumble by not believing in Messiah. Have they just stumbled so far as to say that God is just completely done with them permanently? This is the question that we will look at for the next 2 weeks. And Paul gives three answers to this, the first of which we will look at this morning. What he will say in verses 11 through 16 is this. What happened to Israel, meaning when they refused to believe in Messiah, and if they continue to do that, God has parlayed, if you will, into two beautiful things. He has parlayed it into the Gentiles now believing, which is why we're here now, quite frankly. And then he took all these Gentiles that were believing, and he pointed it back to the Jews, and he said, doesn't that irritate you a little bit? These are pagan people. These are people that never pursued God, and they're finding me. And it's almost as if God is needling the Jews so that some of them would become jealous and believe. Brian and I were talking about this very passage this week, and he was talking about his Irish descent. And he said, you know, in Ireland, for millennia, they worship the sun, right? And who was the saint? It was St. Patrick. There you go. I should know that. I'm Irish. So St. Patrick comes along, right? Missionaries in Ireland, they give their life to Jesus. They have the cross. Do you know what the cross looks like in Ireland? Help us out, Paul. Our one Irish friend. It's the circle of the sun with the cross superimposed over the top. Isn't that funny? It's a beautiful image of what you and I as Gentiles are like, minus Chris. We're knuckleheads. We're pagans. We weren't even looking for God. We stumbled into this faith thing. The Jews have been pursuing God for millennia. That's the tragedy. And are yet missing Him. Isn't that just so stark? This is what our answer will be this morning. We'll look at the other two answers next week. So let's begin to unpack this quick answer. Granted that ethnic Israel has stumbled, is this permanent? Back at verse 11. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall permanently? By no means, he says, rather through their trespass salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. There's the double whammy that God plays. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their, again, ethnic Israel's failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? So let's unpack a couple of concepts here. This word stumbling and this word full inclusion. First of all, this concept of stumbling. We've seen this before. At the end of chapter 9, in answering this whole big question about whether God has been faithful, Paul says, Israel, you stumbled, and I'm going to show you Old Testament verses to tell you how you stumbled, and you've stumbled twice. You've stumbled in a way that one foreshadowed the other. He says, God met you at Mount Sinai, and He handed you these tablets, right, with Moses. He gave you the Torah, and you took the Torah, and you said, because we have this word from God, we now have permanent status in relationship with God. He says that you stumbled over the Torah. The Torah was never for that purpose. The Torah can only be kept if you fall before God in dependence and say, I can't do these 613 commandments. And the answer that God says back to us is, you're totally right. Now fall in dependence before me, and I will indwell you through my Spirit and empower you to do that which you cannot do. See, they were fooled into thinking that the Torah would produce life. When the words don't produce life, God produces life. The words were pointing to the God and the Messiah that was actually there to produce life. They stumbled over the Torah. And then Paul says, and that, as if that's not bad enough, that was just a mere shadow of what was to come. Because you've now stumbled over the Messiah. The Messiah was right in front of you, and you just stumbled right over him and kept on plowing forward. You should have stopped when he stood before you and bowed your knee to him and realized your king was here. You have stumbled on the Messiah himself. And so what Paul says is, so what? What does God do? Uh-oh. God has a plan, and now man will thwart his plan. What is the purpose of the stumbling? Listen to what it said in chapter 10, verse 19. But I ask, Paul says, did ethnic Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. Who is that? The Gentiles. I'll take a bunch of people in Ireland that worship the sun, as dopey as that sounds, and I will bring them to myself in relationship, and it'll drive you crazy. I'll work with a foolish nation, and I'll make you angry, he says. When Israel stumbled over the stumbling stone of Messiah, it wasn't just an accident. God didn't say, oh my gosh, what do we do now? Jesus and the Spirit, the Son and the Father sitting around going, oh my gosh, they thwarted our plans. Ethnic Israel is not believing us. We don't know what to do now. What does God do? He parlays it into the actual means by which Gentiles get saved. Again, the process was this. Israel is called with a task by Abraham. They are called to bring salvation to the world, and they refuse to do it, not for centuries, for millennia. For 1,500 years, they refuse to bring light to the world. God gives them, for heaven's sake, plumb lines on how to build the temple. He gives them an entire area that is supposed to be for the Gentiles. And what do the Jews do? They cord it all off, and they tell the Gentiles they're not welcome. The nation that was called to be light to the world pushed the world out. They push them out, and they sin. And then ultimately, when God births himself through a Jewish woman to do what Israel refused to do,
so that he could make sure he fulfilled what he promised, which was to save the world through the Jewish nation. So God births himself in Jesus in the form of man, in humanity, and he does it for Israel, and Israel still refuses and rejects him. Their heart was hardened, so God takes Judah and says, fine, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm not going to judge you immediately. I'm going to back off and give time. And here's what's going to happen. I'm going to use this to reach the Gentiles. There's a reason when you drive up and down 680, there's a church 3 minutes that way, full of believers right now worshiping Jesus. There's a church 1 minute that way worshiping Jesus, and a church 2 minutes past that worshiping Jesus right now by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. God took a plan he had that Israel thwarted and resurrected the plan and created life out of it for the Gentiles. It's exactly, he says, what happened with Pharaoh, who was the foreshadow of this. The guy refused to believe. He refused to let my people leave Egypt. He hardened his heart, so what does God do? I'll join in the hardening. I will withhold my judgment for a period of time to give Israel time to escape and give Pharaoh yet one more chance to repent. And isn't this just like God? The God who takes plans that die, he takes things that don't work, and he makes life out of them. Brian and I were driving to one of our cancer clinics on Thursday, and we're driving down, and Brian gets a phone call from a good friend from this church, and I'll leave it at that. And Brian grew up in a very brutal, tragic home with a very crazy mom and a dad who was a narcissist and didn't want to do anything about it because it didn't want to affect his own image. And then Brian had the beautiful luxury as an adult of joining in partnership with his father, and then his father would just steal money from him and do all kinds of lovely things that a narcissistic father would do. There's no good in any of that. If you had a narcissistic parent, you know there's no good in that. Their whole life is about them. They have nothing to give you. There's no acceptance. There's no real love because they're so in love with themselves they can't possibly go outside themselves. So what does God do with this? I'm sitting in the car driving, and Brian gets this phone call, and it's from a person who has grown up with a narcissistic dad. And this person asked Brian, this is happening and this is happening. I don't get it. What do I do? And Brian just rattles off like the book of Proverbs, the wisdom that was pouring out of his mouth that was so obvious to him that I knew nothing about. And at the end of the call, the other person said, oh my gosh, that makes all of this make sense. Now I have a path forward. Now I understand what's happening. This is God. This is God who takes a pile of just not one single good thing in Brian being raised by a narcissistic dad, and he makes life out of it. He helps Brian make sense of it so that he can minister to other people with Brian next to him. And then Brian gets to watch people get healed with narcissistic parents. Now, Brian, you're going to have a line of people after church signing up for appointments on how to manage their narcissistic father. So I apologize for that. So that's the explanation of the stumbling. Israel stumbles and God parlays it into the Gentiles believe in. And then he parlays it a second time into Israel becoming jealous. And there's also this weird statement. And he says, and then in the end, it'll be for the for ethnic Israel's full inclusion. It's a very weird comment. This is the first time Paul seems to suggest that there's going to be an increase in number where the Jews actually are believing in Jesus en masse. He has not said this up until now through the whole story in Romans. But now it sounds like something is happening. This word fullness is a very, very odd word, and it's a word that Paul does not use in his writings very often. He just so happens to use the same word, fullness, just a few verses later in chapter 11. We'll be looking at this verse next week. But it gives us a great contextual understanding as to what Paul might mean. Like, what does that mean? Like, all these Jews will be saved. Does that mean every ethnic Jew will be saved? one point in time? Does that mean all of them at that time, and then even the ones that have died? I mean, what does it mean? Listen to what he says later on in the chapter. He says in verse 25, lest you be wise in your conceit. He's talking to the Gentiles now, by the way. I'll just let you in on that. He turns to the Gentiles and he says, I want to talk to you guys for a second in these little house churches. I want to make sure that you don't be wise in your own conceit. I want you to understand this mystery, brothers, that a partial hardening came upon Israel, and it is there until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Does this mean that every single Gentile will come to believe in Jesus at the end of the time? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. There are Gentiles that don't believe now. I think that in the end of times, when Jesus returns, there will be Gentiles that don't believe then. I think what this fullness means is those that eventually will come to Jesus, those Gentiles that will come, the total number that will join the covenant family when all is said and done. So if we take that word and then back it up a few verses to our verse, it would mean the same thing with the Jews. I don't think it means that every Jew will be saved. Though there are clear verses in like the book of Joel and Revelation, I think, that give a clear indication there will be an increased number of Jews that bow their knee to Jesus. They will look on him whom they have pierced and go, oh my gosh, we made a mistake. So what it means, I think, is the total number of Jews, and it will be more, that come to Jesus when all is said and done. This is what I think he is doing. Again, not to lose sight of what Paul is saying. Look, ethnic Israel isn't believing. It appears they're trying to thwart God's plan. So what does the sovereign one do? He parlays it into the Gentiles coming to him and then making the Jews jealous so that they come to him too. And in the end, he's going to do some things in history so that the total number of Jews and Gentiles he can bring in will come in. Verse 13. Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. Now he says, I'm going to get specific with you now. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous. By the way, the Jews are reading this letter too. And thus save some of them. For if their rejection, meaning the Jews' rejection, means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. So what does Paul say with all this to these churches he's looking at? Well, he tells them that I want to warn you Gentiles, do not become arrogant. Do not overstate your place in the family of God. And by that I mean do not overstate your place as if you were in a higher prominence than the Jewish people, particularly those that aren't coming to believe. You can just feel this movement Paul is making that will start in 2 weeks. How he wants them to start realizing what God has done for them so they treat each other with love and dignity and forgiveness and compassion and understanding. Look at these verses again, verse 13. I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. You can tell, by the way, why Paul was almost killed so many times in the synagogue by words like this. There will always be some of Abraham's physical descendants included in those who believe, he says. Verse 15, but if Israel's rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? He is drawing on a picture that he gave in chapter 5. And it's what I would refer, and what commentators refer as a recapitulation. When I use words like this, my wife often accuses me of having a word of the day calendar. And I don't. I actually I read and actually learn something every now and then which shocks everybody. I realize this. If you're not familiar with the word recapitulation, it's a repeat. It's a foreshadowing. In other words, In other words, Pharaoh does what he does, and Israel recapitulates that. You know, God gets Israel out during the Passover with the whole Passover lamb. Jesus recapitulates that as the Lamb of God. It's a repeat, or this is a shadow of what is to come. And this whole idea in chapter 15, their rejection, Israel rejecting Messiah, actually becomes a reconciliation for the world. It comes right out of Romans 5. You'll remember what he tells us in chapter 5. He says, Israel refuses to follow through on the task that I gave Abraham. They won't reach the world. So what does God do? God says, you're not thwarting my plan. He births himself in humanity. Right? And then what do they do with Jesus when he comes? They reject him. And they kill him. And through the one man's death, Jesus, reconciliation comes to the world. One man dies, and all of us in this room that have placed our faith in Jesus are saved. He says, it's a weird deal, but if I flip the coin over, Israel is a recapitulation of that. They reject Messiah, and God brings reconciliation to the Gentiles. God takes a really negative thing where his plans are thwarted, and he resurrects the plan. Maybe another way of saying this is, Jesus gets killed out of his innocence, and he redeems mankind. Israel sins, they refuse to believe, and the Messiah is killed. And yet still God brings salvation to the world. And Paul wants these Gentiles that are listening and reading these letters to realize this and to appreciate this, to know that they're the beneficiaries of this. That Israel sinned and ultimately rejected the Messiah. And God holds his judgment back, the hardening, for a time so that he can bring Gentiles in and then make the Jews jealous and bring them, hopefully, to faith as well. At the end of Romans 11, he says this, just as you, Gentiles, were at one time disobedient to God, but now you have received mercy because of Israel's disobedience. So they too now have been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also might receive mercy. I'm not saying, and please don't add words to me this morning, that Israel has died on our behalf. That is not what I'm saying in any way. What I am saying is that the Jews refused to follow God. They refused to do what they were asked to do. They reject his Messiah, and God's plans are thwarted, and yet God is not thwarted. The hardening comes along, creating breathing space for the Gentiles. And Paul looks at the Gentiles and he says, and when a Jew comes to Jesus, and they will come in mass at one point, it's like a second Easter. And we need to celebrate it. Brian and I also talked about this. You know, when Ellen Goldsmith, our beautiful Jewish woman, who's battling cancer down in Southern California, and we should remember to pray for her. She has spoken with us many times in this church. She was a professor at Biola and just a dynamo counselor. When I'm with her, and I've had many dinners and meals with her, when I sit next to her, there's a feeling that I don't belong. Does that make sense? There's a feeling that I'm a second-class citizen. And I say that in not a bad way. Because she never makes me feel like that. But I realize I'm sitting with the grandeur of God's people that were called to bring the torch forward. And I stumbled into this whole deal. I'm the sun worshiper that God superimposed the cross on. Verse 16, if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But during the Feast of Weeks, they would have a big vat of dough. They would take the first piece of that dough out. They would offer it to God, and it would be holy. They would then reintroduce that to the whole lump, and it sanctified the whole batch of dough. He says the same thing is true of the root and the branches. The root, he says, is this holy piece, and it cascades its holiness, if you will, to the rest of the branches. And really, these two pieces are the bigger group, the second groups, the whole lump, and the branches is ethnic Israel, and they don't believe. but there's a group within them that believes, like Chris Kelso. And they remind us how holy the whole thing is. That we should realize that when we're with a Jewish person, man, I've been to Israel a lot. When I'm there, I feel the respect that they owe. These are the chosen people of God to carry the torch of salvation forward. These are the relatives of my Messiah. And they deserve that respect. That's why when you see things like Nazism, when you see things like the Crusades, it's so nauseating. Because it cuts against the grain so deeply of what God is doing. Tam, you can throw up that last slide, but I just want to close on this point. Two things that I think Paul is really trying to bring out. Maybe one directly and maybe one that I'm inserting, I'm not sure. As Gentiles, we should feel a deep sense of gratitude. Maybe even deeper than the Jewish people. Because God has gone so far to bring us into this family. We should always have a sense. I mean, do you realize the sun worshiper, if you will, the whole Old Testament is now my story. It's my history. Abraham is my forefather. This Norwegian, Irish, Italian guy up here. I deserve none of that. It is a mirror. It is a picture of my entire salvation with Jesus. None of it which I deserve. So there should be deep gratitude. And really, I think that kind of gratitude should be reflected then in how we see one another. Not just Jewish people, but other Gentiles. We're so hard on everybody else. Oftentimes, my wife and I we walk together a lot, or I'll be out. If you ever just listen to people, it's fascinating. Most people's conversations, if you tune in, if you're nosy, so those of you that really know what I'm talking about, you'll realize they're usually talking about another person, and it's usually negative. Have you ever noticed this? Have you ever just been walking or been in a restaurant and you listen, and it's just this pettiness about other people? I think this is what Paul is driving us away from. And this is what chapter 12 through 16, I think, will lean us out of. When we really realize what God has done for us. And we realize how far off each of us really are and were. Then boy, the person in front of you starts looking a lot better. The second thought, and this is the one I will interject, but I'm sure Paul would say this, because he's way smarter than me. And that is, this God of ours, crazy enough, never seems to be thwarted. He comes up with a plan, and it gets messed with. In fact, more than that, it dies, and God brings it life out. Right? He gives the Jews a task, they won't do it. So what does he do? The three of them huddle up, and they say, no problem, we'll birth one of our own. We'll birth an Israelite out of the three of us. And then what do with God's plan? They kill his plan. They kill his son. And what does God do? He resurrects him and brings salvation to the world. And then the Jews en masse still don't believe, and what does God do? You're not going to kill my plan. It bumps me out, but you're not going to kill my plan. So I will bring the Gentiles in masse, and then I'll make the Jews jealous. And I'll resurrect life. This is my whole life. Plans that just die. Right? I met Linda in high school where I was just in love with her. I met her as a junior in high school. I was 16, she was 18. She found out I was 16 and she said, come back when you're 18. This is where I won. The day before my birthday, she agreed to be boyfriend and girlfriend, so I was 16. So for a day, she was dating a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. So to me, I'm not sure that's legal, quite frankly. We dated for 3 years. She was the only thing I wanted. I just wanted to marry Linda. And finally, Linda said, this ain't working really well. So I'm going to go try out some others. And poor Linda had 7 marriages between her 2 parents. So marriage was like, if I do this, I'm doing this, right? I was shattered. I would just sit there and say, I'm just going to wait for you. I'm just going to wait for you, which was part of my problem. After 6 months, my plan died. And after 6 months, right, I just finally realized, okay, God, my plan's dead. This is not working. I got some stuff to change. And lo and behold, when I just moved out of the plan that died, God resurrected a plan. And 30 years of marriage later, here I am.
Woo!
Amen.
And I'll say this only because there's a few new people here today. I got the better end of the stick on this one. The rest of you already know this, so for those of you who are new, I'll just explain that to you. You probably figured that out in a 30-minute sermon. I wanted this career. I had this great career, and then I switched jobs. And in this job that I started to work with Brian finally, and what happens? The company's going under. I had a plan, I had stock options, and I got fired along with almost every other officer because the company wasn't making it. I had a plan and it died. And what did God do? He resurrected a company that was Brian and my company. And every day since then, 15 years, 14 years, I don't know, every day, and I know Brian would say the same thing, I can't figure out how I got here. I had a dream. I wanted a piece of property. And lo and behold, after 9 years of marriage and 7 years in this first house, we found a property in the neighborhood I grew up in, of all things. And we bought it, and we built a house, and for a year we were going under financially, $1,000 a month. And Lynn and I decided, all right, we're going to pray for 2 months, and then we're going to sell the house. And I got 2 promotions for the phone company and a 33% raise, which, if you work for a phone company, does not happen. And God resurrected the dead. What plan do you have that has died? Here's what's hard. I can't look at you people personally because I know most of you. And I know many of your stories. You have plans that are in the process of dying. You have had a plan that has died. And you have a big choice in front of you. Do you bury under that? Or do you turn to the God who, by the way, invented plans dying and say, I think you can handle this. They killed his son, people. And God resurrected him and saved humanity. Trust me, he can fix my marriage and dating relationships and my stupid house I wanted to hold on to and my job and any other thing. The flat tire you get on the way to work, right? The vacation that fell apart. The kid that's not going the direction you want in your plan, by the way, which may be half the problem, I've learned now. I had a plan for who was going to marry my daughter, and this knucklehead shows up, and he was exactly the opposite of what I thought, and I said, he's out. I don't like him. Of course, I didn't like anybody else you brought over. I am in love with this guy. I don't love him. I am in love with this guy. He's exactly what she should have been with. Praise God, the plan died. Amen? Let's pray. Father, we acknowledge to you, because we kind of get self-focused, that your plans have gone down the tubes. Not just ours. And yet, in your sovereignty, in your deep wisdom, and in your compassion and love and forbearance and understanding, and dare I say, willingness to be in pain, you resurrect that which was not. Father, as we enter this prolonged time of worship, talk to us. Lean into us. Share with us that which we grip. And allow us to sit before that tomb of that dead plan
and turn to you. To look for life when we can't see any. As we sing of your Son, may you build our trust and our faith. Open our eyes and our ears that we might see the resurrection of Jesus. The great and grand resurrection. And it's in His name we pray.